Midnight, Holloway Ridge, Kentucky. A sheriff's cruiser crawls along the dirt road, headlights swallowed by the black woods. Inside sits a deputy, knuckles white on the steering wheel, fighting the urge to turn back. The air feels wrong, heavy, charged, like a storm about to break. At the top of the ridge, an old farmhouse waits, sagging like a wounded animal. Its windows are boarded, its paint long gone, and its porch sags under decades of rot. From somewhere deep inside comes a sound that doesn't belong in this world. Part cry, part growl, part something else. When they force the door open, the stench of death and sickness hits like a physical blow. And in the farthest, darkest corner of that house, they find a crib. What was inside that crib would haunt everyone who saw it, because it wasn't just the end of a family line. It was the beginning of something no one could explain. If this story already has you on edge, hit that like button. It really helps us share more haunting mysteries like this one. And if you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of the Holloway story. Got a theory about what they found that night? Drop it in the comments. We read every single one. The night air was thick with the smell of wet earth as Deputy Raymond Cole eased the cruiser up Holloway Ridge Road, tires crunching softly on the gravel. Beside him, Sheriff Luke Branson sat silent. Neither man spoke, but both felt the pressure of that strange call. The radio dispatch had been calm, almost routine. Neighbors reported animal-like cries, not the first complaint about this property. Tonight felt different, though. Luke's flashlight lay across his lap, his thumb resting on the switch. Every instinct told him they should wait for backup, but no one wanted to drive up Holloway Ridge after midnight. The farmhouse loomed ahead like a blackened tooth, sagging under decades of decay. Its roof was buckled, its porch listing dangerously, but the door was closed tight, as if the house was holding its breath. Raymond killed the engine and silence descended, so heavy it felt like weight pressing on their skulls. Then, faintly, that sound again, a cry unlike anything human. It rose and fell in a strange rhythm, part moan, part howl, carrying through the trees until every hair on Luke's arms stood on end. He motioned for Raymond to cut the lights. Darkness swallowed the cruiser, leaving them lit only by the moon and stars. Luke stepped out first, boots sinking into mud, breath fogging in the cold air. Raymond followed, shotgun gripped too tightly. They approached the porch slowly, wood creaking under their boots. Every step was louder than it should have been, like the house itself was amplifying their presence, warning whoever was inside they were coming. Luke reached the door and pressed his ear to the peeling wood. The sound was clearer now, a keening, rising and falling like some twisted lullaby. He exhaled, then knocked. No answer. The two men stood listening, hearts hammering. The sound didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder, as if whatever was making it knew they were there and didn't care. Luke nodded to Raymond. Together they forced the swollen door, splintering the frame. The stench hit first, sweet, rotting, heavy enough to make Raymond gag and wipe his sleeve across his mouth. Flashlights cut through a darkness so dense it seemed solid. Dust swirled in their beams, revealing a hallway choked with hanging sheets, rotting furniture, and makeshift barricades that forced them to twist sideways to pass. Everywhere smelled of mold and decay. Rat droppings littered the floor. The sound was close now, echoing through the cramped passageways like something calling from deep underwater. Luke's chest tightened with unease. They moved room by room, clearing each one carefully. Most were empty except for broken furniture and piles of rags that might once have been clothes. The smell only grew stronger as they advanced. Raymond's light caught something scrawled on a wall. Strange markings scratched into the plaster, circles within circles, lines crisscrossing like a map or ritual. Luke paused, unsettled, then pressed on toward the sound. It came from the farthest room in the house. A door hung half open, and beyond it lay darkness so complete their flashlights seemed swallowed whole. Luke's throat was dry when he stepped inside. The beam of his light cut across the floor first, filthy boards smeared with dirt and what looked like dried blood. Then it landed on the far corner of the room. There was a crib there, an old wooden crib, its paint flaking away, swaying slightly as if something had just moved inside. The sound was coming from it, thin and high-pitched. Luke took one cautious step forward, heart pounding. The smell was overwhelming now, metallic and sweet, like copper left too long in the rain. Raymond raised his shotgun, covering him silently. When the flashlight beam finally struck what was inside, Luke froze. For a second, his brain refused to understand what he was seeing. It was small, human-shaped, but not right. Its limbs were twisted in ways that made no sense, bending where no joints should be. The head was too long, the face arranged wrong, as if put together by someone guessing at human form. And then the eyes opened. Too many eyes. They caught the flashlight beam and glinted wetly, each one moving independently, tracking Luke and Raymond as if studying them, calculating something neither man wanted to imagine. The sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Luke's stomach turned cold. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a sick child. It was something else. Something that should not have been possible. From behind them came a shuffle of feet. Luke spun, light cutting across the doorway, and there stood two figures, thin, hunched men with faces almost as misshapen as the thing in the crib. Their eyes gleamed in the flashlight beam. They didn't speak, only stood there breathing heavily, staring at the intruders like predators guarding a nest. Raymond's finger hovered over the trigger. Luke raised a hand, signaling him to wait. The figures stepped aside slowly, as if inviting them to look, to witness what lay in that crib. It felt less like threat, more like ritual. Raymond's skin crawled. The child, if it was a child, began to move, reaching one twisted limb toward them. Its fingers branched like roots, each joint moving independently in a grotesque ripple. Luke backed away, heart slamming against his ribs. "We need backup," he whispered, voice barely audible. Raymond nodded, but neither man turned their back on the crib until they reached the doorway. Outside, the night air felt like freedom. They stumbled onto the porch, sucking in deep breaths as if they'd been underwater too long. Behind them, the sound started again, a low, rising wail. They retreated to the cruiser without speaking, boots slipping in the mud. When they finally slammed the doors shut, Raymond's hands were shaking so badly he could barely put the keys in the ignition. Luke grabbed his radio and called dispatch, his voice hoarse. "We need immediate backup at Holloway Ridge. Get social services, get anyone. We've got a situation out here." His voice broke on the last word. As they waited for the distant wail of sirens, the two men sat in silence, staring at the dark house. Neither wanted to admit what they'd seen. Some truths were too heavy for words. When backup arrived, the house was searched top to bottom. The two twisted men were found sitting silently by the crib, unmoving as if waiting for judgment. The child never stopped watching. The farmhouse was sealed off by morning. Word spread through the county like wildfire that something had been found up there, something not quite human. But the details were locked behind official reports. For Luke and Raymond, the images of that night would never leave. The house, the crib, the way those eyes followed them, and the sound still echoed in their dreams. Even now, years later, Luke swears he sometimes hears it when the wind comes down from the ridge. That same keening cry, faint but clear, as if calling him back to finish what began. Some nights he wakes in a cold sweat, convinced that if he ever returns to that house, what waits inside will still be there, waiting for him, watching, just as it did that night. And deep down, he knows he will go back one day. Not because duty demands it, but because some secrets won't stay buried. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be shut. Ezekiel Holloway came to the Kentucky hills in 1847 with a single purpose: to disappear. He was a man carrying secrets heavier than any wagon could bear, secrets that made him dangerous to others. No court records explain what drove him into isolation, but whispers from neighboring towns tell of a dispute turned bloody, a man who walked away leaving 3 bodies and a smoldering farmstead behind him. When Ezekiel found the ridge that would bear his name, he saw more than land. He saw sanctuary. Towering trees formed a natural wall, and the hills curled inward like clasped hands. Here, he told himself, no outsider would ever come uninvited. Here, a man could shape the future of his bloodline without interference from lawmen, judges, or strangers with opinions about how life should be lived. Ezekiel's first act was to build a cabin with his own hands, logs fitted tight, hearth dug deep. By the end of that first winter, smoke rose steady from its chimney. The following spring, he was joined by 2 brothers, kin who shared his conviction that the outside world had grown corrupt. Together, they felled trees, hunted game, and expanded the small clearing. But Ezekiel's vision stretched beyond survival. He spoke often around the fire about purity, about how the world beyond the ridge was rotting from within, its people growing weak and soft from mixing bloodlines. His brothers listened, nodding. They trusted him. Ezekiel had always been the strongest of them, the man who took the lead during hard times. If he said purity mattered, then purity would guide them. Soon the Holloway clearing became a compound, cabins multiplying like seedlings after rain. Each one housed men bound by oath, men who believed they had been chosen to keep their lineage unbroken. Ezekiel kept a journal, leather-bound and meticulously written. In it, he spoke of blood as holy water, of a duty given to him by Providence. Keep the Holloway name untainted for generations. This was no passing thought. It became a doctrine. Ezekiel read from the journal at every gathering, reciting lines like scripture, until even the youngest boys knew the words by heart. Visitors were rare, but when they came, Ezekiel met them with a polite distance. No stranger was allowed to stay overnight. No deals were struck that might bring outsiders too close. The men who followed Ezekiel took wives from among their own kin, cousins marrying cousins, brothers forging pacts to keep their children within the fold. The family tree began curling back on itself. Neighbors down the valley whispered about it. Some said Ezekiel's men were zealots, others claimed they were simply stubborn mountain folk who didn't trust outsiders. Either way, the Holloways kept to themselves. By the 1860s, Ezekiel had become more than a patriarch. He was a prophet to his kin. His journal now held dozens of entries outlining the laws of Holloway Ridge. The first law was bloodline purity. The second was secrecy. The third was loyalty to the ridge itself, never abandoning the land, never giving it to strangers, never letting outsiders claim it. He believed the land was alive, that it had chosen them as much as they had chosen it. Leaving would mean betrayal. Diluting the bloodline would mean spiritual death. Men who questioned this were confronted by Ezekiel personally. Few ever questioned twice. Ezekiel was known for his stare, a look that could pin a man until he swore himself back into obedience. As years passed, the Holloway children grew and married one another, cousins becoming husbands, nephews becoming fathers. Birth defects were noted but dismissed as trials sent by God to test their faith. Ezekiel wrote that such trials proved they were on the right path. "Iron sharpens iron," he scrawled, "and blood made strong by hardship shall endure when the weak are washed away." During the war years, when Union troops passed through Kentucky, they avoided Holloway Ridge entirely. Soldiers spoke of strange sounds from the trees, of men watching silently from the shadows, never intervening. The Holloway clan thrived through it all, untouched by war's chaos. Their livestock multiplied, their crops grew tall, and their boys learned to hunt with deadly precision before they reached manhood. By the time Ezekiel was an old man, the ridge was entirely Holloway land. No one else dared to settle near it. Travelers knew better than to wander past the tree line. Ezekiel's journal in those later years took on a darker tone. He began speaking of enemies unseen, forces from outside that sought to break their bloodline and scatter their sacred seed. His entries became almost paranoid, warning of intrusions that never came, describing dreams in which strangers burned the cabins and cut down the trees, leaving the ridge barren and silent. In response, Ezekiel ordered new rules. No one was to leave without his blessing, no marriages to outsiders, no trading beyond what was absolutely necessary to survive the winter. The Holloway Ridge became a kingdom unto itself, Ezekiel its king. Boys grew up hearing his voice like thunder on Sundays, reciting the laws that bound them tighter than any rope. When Ezekiel died, they buried him on the highest point of the ridge. His journal was placed in a chest beside him, though copies of its laws had already spread among the cabins. The men stood in silence around the grave, hats pressed to their chests. One of Ezekiel's sons stepped forward and swore they would keep the oath until the bloodline ended or the world did. That promise held. For the next 2 generations, the Holloways followed Ezekiel's words to the letter. Outsiders were shunned, marriages arranged within the clan, and the family tree twisted into a single vertical branch. But time was already beginning to show the price. Children were born with extra digits, with jaws too narrow, with hearing that faded before they could speak their first words. Still, the men saw these as marks of chosen blood, signs that they were different, set apart from the valley people. They called such children blessed, not cursed, and raised them proudly. The ridge became quieter with each generation. Holloway boys stopped traveling to market altogether, relying on hunting and barter with the few neighbors still brave enough to approach their boundary fences. By the 1870s, the ridge was a place of deepening isolation. The last Holloway who attempted to leave never returned. Some said he was hunted down. Others whispered the ridge itself took him. What began as a man's bid for sanctuary had transformed into something far more consuming. The Holloway name was now less a family than a creed, a living vow stretching forward in time. And somewhere in the dark earth of that ridge, Ezekiel's bones lay beneath the roots, his vision fulfilled, a bloodline sealed, a destiny forged, a legacy that would twist itself tighter with every generation. By the dawn of the 20th century, Holloway Ridge had become a world unto itself, a place where seasons turned but little else changed. Outsiders spoke of it as if it were cursed. The family tree now resembled a single column. Cousins marrying cousins, uncles taking nieces as brides, fathers arranging unions between nephews and sons' sons to keep the line tight. No blood entered from beyond. The first troubling signs appeared quietly. Boys born with 6 fingers, some missing an ear, others speaking only in guttural noises. The Holloways called these marks divine, tokens of their ancestral promise. By 1910, the family's spoken language had begun to fracture. It was still English, but slow and twisted, laced with strange whistles and clicks that only they understood, a private tongue born from isolation. Neighbors in the valley stopped venturing near after dark. Men crossing the ridgeline to hunt sometimes returned pale, swearing they'd seen figures watching from the trees, standing too still, eyes reflecting torchlight. Doctors were rarely called, but when one did visit, he left shaken. His notes, later found, described boys with bones too soft, skulls elongated, and spines curving like vines. He never returned. Despite this, the Holloways continued their rituals. Every spring, men gathered at Ezekiel's grave, reading from copies of his journal, vowing once more to keep the bloodline pure, whatever the cost might be. Some of the younger men began to question, but questioning was dangerous. Dissenters were brought before the elders. their doubts burned away in a fire of prayer, fear, and the weight of tradition. The years rolled forward, and the family withdrew deeper into their ridge kingdom. Crops grew untended in distant fields, barns sagged, yet inside their hidden world, children kept coming, generation after generation. By the 1930s, their isolation had created something wholly unique. Their faces carried the same sharp jawlines, the same hollow eyes, until they looked less like individuals and more like repetitions of one design. A county physician named Nathan Crenshaw was the last to treat them regularly. Between 1943 and 1945, he made 3 house calls and recorded observations that would later horrify medical researchers. He described boys with cranial malformations that twisted their foreheads into strange slopes, limbs that bent at unnatural angles yet functioned perfectly, and eyes that tracked movement independently as if each possessed its own mind. Most disturbing to him was their lack of pain response. He wrote of a child resting his palm on a stove's hot iron and smiling as blistered flesh hissed under the heat. Crenshaw concluded his final note with a single chilling line. "What I have seen cannot be forgotten. The Holloways may not be entirely human any longer. I will not return." When word of his death years later reached the county, locals said it was fitting. Some claimed he had seen too much, that knowledge itself had consumed him as surely as disease might. The Holloways grew stranger with every generation. Hunters whispered of figures moving through the woods on all fours, silent and swift, their twisted bodies still somehow graceful, their breath fogging in the moonlight. By the 1950s, they no longer came to town. The general store closed its ledger on their account. The postman left their mail at the bottom of the hill, never daring to climb. Electric lines were offered but refused. The family preferred oil lamps, firelight, and the glow of moon on bark. They wanted nothing from beyond the ridge that might tether them to outsiders. Reverend Marcus Kane was the last man to stay with them willingly. He arrived in 1952 carrying a Bible and a stubborn faith that no soul was beyond redemption. His diary survives in fragments, water-damaged and stained, but his words are harrowing. "They speak in tongues," he wrote, "but not the tongues of heaven. It is language born of the earth itself." He stayed 3 nights. By the 3rd, he wrote that the boys moved like shadows, darting between trees on all fours, their eyes gleaming with a strange cunning that made his skin crawl. Kane left before sunrise on the 4th day and never returned. His final entry reads simply, "These hills are not mine to save. Whatever lives here has chosen its own God." After Kane's visit, the Holloways vanished entirely from public record. No births were registered, no deaths recorded. For 35 years, they existed beyond census takers, doctors, or any traceable paper trail. Yet signs of them lingered. Hunters found prints in the mud that were almost human but longer, narrower, as though the bones had shifted under skin. Livestock sometimes vanished from farms near the ridge. Locals whispered that the Holloways had left the plow and returned to older ways. Foraging, hunting, perhaps taking what they needed from any living thing unfortunate enough to cross their path. In those years, the ridge became a place of fear. Radios crackled with static when pointed toward it. Photographs taken near the tree line developed with warped shadows no one could explain. Some swore that on moonless nights you could hear chanting, low and rhythmic, carrying across the hills. Others claimed to hear laughter, shrill and wrong, cutting through the dark like broken glass. The Holloways themselves were rarely seen, but when they were, it was always the boys. Gaunt, pale figures who stared without blinking, then melted back into the trees like mist dissipating at dawn. The valley men taught their sons to avoid the ridge entirely. Paths that once led to trading posts were abandoned, overgrown with brambles, left as a warning not to disturb whatever dwelled there. By the 1970s, the Holloways had become legend, a campfire story told to scare boys into obedience. Yet those who lived closest knew better. The ridge still breathed. The Holloways were still there. Every so often, hunters would glimpse something between the trees. A twisted silhouette, too tall, too thin. Its limbs bending wrong, moving with an eerie fluidity that didn't belong to man or beast. The sheriff's office logged the occasional complaint of strange sounds, inhuman cries, or trespassers glimpsed in the fields. Each report ended the same way. No arrests, no suspects, just silence from the ridge. Those who dared to approach the house said it looked abandoned from a distance, but closer inspection revealed smoke stains around the chimney, footprints in the mud, and sometimes faint singing from inside. The ridge had become more than land. It was now a living inheritance, a closed loop of blood and bone, a place where time folded back on itself and refused to move forward. And in that looping silence, the Holloway bloodline twisted ever tighter, generation after generation, until whatever waited in that crib decades later was no longer an accident. It was the inevitable conclusion. By the early 1940s, the Holloway family had moved past simple isolation. Their bloodline was no longer just narrowing, it was mutating. Each generation brought traits that no doctor could chart, no textbook could explain. The boys born in those years were different from birth. Some arrived silent, never crying, simply staring with unsettling calm. Others made sounds that weren't words at all, strange clicking noises that echoed through the cabins at night. Neighbors whispered about seeing them in the woods, their thin bodies moving with uncanny speed, their heads snapping toward sounds no human could have heard. The ridge seemed alive with unseen eyes. Josiah Holloway, Ezekiel's great-grandson, became the patriarch during this era. He was a severe man with deep-set eyes and a jaw like carved stone. His word was law, his presence enough to quiet a room. Josiah married his own cousin, as his father had before him. They produced 7 sons, each more unusual than the last. When she died, birthing the 8th, Josiah turned to the next generation. He took his eldest son's wife as his own, insisting it was the will of the bloodline. No man challenged him. To do so would have meant exile, a fate worse than death. The children from this union disturbed even other Holloways. They walked differently, almost gliding, and their voices carried a strange resonance that made conversation with them feel like speaking inside a deep well. At night, hunters saw them moving through the trees, running on all fours with an unnatural grace, stopping only to stare with eyes that gleamed like wet stones in lantern light. Josiah saw these changes as a sign. "The blood is speaking," he told the men one night at Ezekiel's grave. "It is shaping us into what we were meant to become." Some of the younger Holloways were afraid. They spoke in hushed tones about the boys who didn't blink, who didn't flinch at fire or pain. But no one dared confront Josiah directly. The farmhouse became a labyrinth in those years. Rooms were sealed off, hallways boarded, windows nailed shut. Outsiders who dared approach swore they heard scratching from inside and low voices chanting. By the late 1940s, no one in the county doubted that something was wrong on Holloway Ridge. Men who went too near sometimes came back sick, complaining of headaches, fevers, and vivid nightmares. Some reported hearing whispers long after leaving the property, as if words had followed them home, clinging like smoke. A few refused ever to return, claiming the ridge had marked them. It was during this period that the first disappearances occurred. A drifter vanished near the ridge road. A farmhand went missing after delivering feed. No evidence was found, only rumors and fear. Josiah said nothing to the few neighbors who came asking questions. He simply stood on the porch, silent and motionless, until they left, unable to withstand the weight of his unblinking stare. Inside, the clan's hierarchy grew more rigid. Elders decided which boys would marry, who would sleep where, even when hunting parties could leave. No decision was made without Josiah's grim approval. The youngest boys began to show traits that startled even their fathers: double-jointed limbs, pupils that seemed too wide, an ability to see in near darkness. They were becoming something beyond ordinary men. Local hunters started finding strange signs in the woods: bones arranged in spiral patterns, trees stripped of bark in perfect circles, mud impressions that looked like hands but with too many fingers. By the early 1950s, the Holloways were no longer just a family, but a closed system, a living experiment. Nature itself seemed to bend around them, as though they had crossed some hidden threshold. When Reverend Cain arrived, he found a clan that had abandoned traditional worship. They still prayed, but their prayers were not to any god he recognized. They spoke in strange harmonies, voices overlapping. Cain stayed 3 nights. On the second, he wrote that the boys gathered around his bed, staring at him with their unblinking eyes, whispering in unison words he could not understand, but somehow felt. By the 3rd night, Cain said he could feel something pressing on his chest as he slept, as though the ridge itself was breathing with him, forcing him into rhythm with its pulse. He left before dawn and warned the sheriff not to go back. "They are past saving," he wrote. "What lives up there is no longer fully ours. It belongs to the hills now." After that, the Holloways vanished entirely from public life. The farmhouse became a sealed fortress. Windows were covered, doors barricaded, and no one came down into the valley anymore, not even for supplies. The family survived on hunting and foraging, though neighbors claimed livestock still disappeared now and then. Some suspected darker means of survival, but no one dared investigate closely enough to confirm. By the 1960s, Holloway Ridge was spoken of only in warnings. Fathers told their sons to stay away or risk never returning. The ridge had become a place of dread and whispered curses. Yet within those walls, life continued. More boys were born, each bearing stranger traits. Some never spoke, only howled. Others seemed to anticipate events before they happened, moving before a sound was made. The clan's rituals became more elaborate. At night, fires burned in patterns visible from the valley. Witnesses swore they saw figures dancing, bodies twisting in ways no joint should allow, silhouetted against the flames. Even the animals seemed changed. Dogs barked at nothing when near the ridge. Deer avoided the hills entirely. Birds flew wide around it, as if the sky itself had been warned away. Some said the ridge had become hungry, demanding its own sacrifices, and that the Holloways were feeding it in ways outsiders could never understand. The property seemed to breathe like a living thing. By the 1970s, Holloway Ridge was a dead zone. The mailman left letters at the foot of the road. Utility workers refused to climb the hill. It was as though civilization had surrendered. When men passed the ridge on horseback, they sometimes saw faces at the windows, pale, thin, watching without expression. One rider said he saw a boy smile with teeth too sharp. Even in daylight, the place felt wrong. Shadows lingered too long, sounds carried too far. Men left quickly, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on their backs until they reached the valley again. Whatever the Holloways had become, it was no longer an accident of birth. It was the result of generations of choice, a bloodline sculpted by belief until it had turned into something else. And somewhere deep inside that farmhouse behind barricaded doors, something was still growing, still changing, waiting for the night when outsiders would come again and see what the Holloway vision had finally produced. They warned us never to follow the howls past Millbrook's last streetlight. Not because of wolves, not because of ghosts, but because of the Blackwoods. For 8 generations, this family slept beside dogs, not as pets, but as partners, guardians, maybe even something more. It started as survival. A young farmer named Eli Blackwood once claimed a pack of half-wild dogs saved him from freezing in the blizzard of 1872. But survival turned into ritual, and ritual turned into obsession. Locals whispered about children with sharp amber eyes, boys who ran on all fours, and laughter that broke into growls. By the time electricity reached Millbrook, the Blackwoods were something else entirely, something that didn't belong in town. Tonight, we follow their bloodline, 8 generations of men who chose the company of beasts over the world outside their valley. And if you keep listening, you'll understand why even today, no one dares speak their name after dark. Before we dive in, take a second to hit like and subscribe. It helps bring more of these strange, dark stories straight to you. And let me know in the comments. If you heard something howling in the dark, would you follow it? Or lock the door? The winter of 1872 came like a hammer across Millbrook, turning fields to white deserts and rivers to stone. Men cursed into their scarves, teams of oxen froze where they stood, and neighbors vanished without a trace. Eli Blackwood was one of those neighbors, a young farmer with cracked hands and stubborn pride. When the blizzard swallowed his cabin, most assumed they'd dig his frozen body from the drifts come spring thaw. He told the men in the tavern a story no one believed. He said the dogs had come, not to attack, not to steal food, but to circle him through the night, pressing their bodies close until the storm passed. At first, the men laughed. Dogs don't save farmers. They raid chicken coops. But Eli's voice carried something that silenced them. There was no boast, only gratitude, and a strange, dangerous devotion. The next spring, Eli returned with 2 of those dogs on rope. They didn't blink when stared at. Their amber eyes followed every movement, as if studying the townsfolk like farmers study livestock before a cull. Neighbors began whispering. They said Eli's farm was no longer just a homestead. It was a den. Smoke still rose from the chimney, but howling answered the church bell, and strange tracks lined the snow. Every son born to the Blackwood line from that winter forward was laid between 2 hounds on the first night of life. Not swaddled in cloth, but in fur, their cries answered by soft growls. The valley had its own rules, and Eli followed them without question. Visitors claimed they heard lullabies sung in a voice gone low and rough, almost a growl itself, the sound vibrating through the thin walls. By the 1880s, Eli's boys moved like their dogs. They prowled tree lines at dusk, their steps too smooth, too soundless for ordinary farm children. Men returning from the hills swore they saw silhouettes drop to all fours. It might have ended there, a strange family tradition hidden in the pines. But the winters returned hard. Each storm took men from Millbrook, yet not a single Blackwood perished, no matter how deep the snow. When questioned, Eli only smiled, that too wide smile that never reached his eyes. He told them the valley provided. The dogs knew the paths no man could find, even in whiteout darkness. By the turn of the century, the Blackwood farm looked more like a compound. Fences higher, barns reinforced, dog pens multiplying like graves in the churchyard. And every night, the valley echoed with strange music. Travelers spoke of seeing shapes watching from the tree line. Not wolves, too tall. Not men, too quick. And when they stepped closer, the shapes melted back into the forest, leaving paw prints too large to follow. By the second generation, the Blackwood sons no longer came to town alone. They brought their hounds, tethered but silent, heads tilted as if they understood every word spoken, judging every man's voice for truth. They paid in coin, never barter, their clothes simple but spotless. The blacksmith once joked that their boots left prints deeper than a man their size should make. No one laughed with him. Huntsmen started returning from the woods with stories. They spoke of seeing boys leap creeks too wide for a human stride, of hearing footsteps beside them when no man walked there, only padded tracks in snow. Each year, the distance between the Blackwoods and Millbrook seemed to grow, not in miles, but in spirit. The men who once drank with Eli no longer spoke his name past sundown, and still the storms came. And still the Blackwoods endured. No frostbite, no hunger, no deaths recorded. It was as if the valley itself bent around them, sheltering them while the rest of Millbrook suffered. One night, a traveling preacher tried to confront Eli, calling his ways unnatural, his sons marked. Eli said nothing, only whistled. From the dark tree line came answering shapes, low, quiet, watching. The preacher left by dawn. No one ever saw him again. Weeks later, his horse was found grazing near the Blackwood fence line, saddle gone, bridle cut clean as if with a sharp blade. The town council debated action, but who would walk into Kine Valley? Even armed men hesitated. They said the forest there swallowed sound, that rifles felt useless where something stronger already claimed the ground. The youngest Blackwood boys started showing features that made men glance twice. Teeth too sharp, eyes that caught lantern light wrong, voices with a roughness that turned laughter into something that raised the hairs on necks. Fathers warned their sons not to cross the valley border, not to follow the strange tracks that started as footprints and ended as paw prints, too deliberate to be an animal, too wild to be human. Millbrook aged while the Blackwoods thrived. As rail lines came through and telegraph poles lined the road, the Blackwood farm stayed untouched, lanterns glowing against the night as if to announce they needed no one. The dogs grew larger, coats dark as soot, their silhouettes more terrifying than wolves. Some men claimed they saw them standing upright only to drop back to 4 legs and vanish between the trees. When Eli finally died, no one attended his burial but his sons. From town, men watched shapes move through the valley all night, pacing back and forth, until the lantern light finally went dark. By morning, a new figure stood on the porch, Eli's eldest, taller, leaner, with the same wide smile and the same 2 dogs at his side. The line would continue, and the valley would stay theirs. Years later, men swore they heard drumming from deep in the pines. Not music, not tools. 3 beats, a pause, then 3 again. Always the same, always just out of reach. Hunters tried following it, but their dogs refused to go forward. Some broke their leashes and bolted back toward town, tails low, ears flat. Whatever called from the valley, it wasn't for them. The Blackwood sons were seen less and less, but their presence was felt more. The wind seemed to carry their voices. Their howls echoed like an announcement, telling Millbrook they were still there, still watching. A trapper once claimed he saw them gathered in a clearing under a new moon, men and dogs side by side, heads thrown back in a single unbroken howl. He left the next morning and never returned. By the late 1890s, the Blackwoods came to town only twice a year, trading for salt, flour, and dog collars. Always before sundown, always leaving silently, always watched until they vanished into the trees. It became an unspoken rule: never follow them home. Never step onto the valley road after dark. If you heard the howls, you stayed inside no matter how close they sounded. Fathers nailed charms over their doors, carved from old oak, whispering prayers to keep whatever lived out there from coming closer. And still, every winter the howls seemed nearer. By the dawn of the new century, Kine Valley belonged entirely to the Blackwoods. The rest of Millbrook may have been carving railroads and ringing church bells, but out there, something older than both was growing. And when strangers came asking questions, when researchers walked into the woods with notebooks and rifles, they didn't always come back. Those who did had eyes like Eli's on that first day. Wide, haunted, unblinking. Millbrook had its legends, its ghost stories, but none carried the same weight as the Blackwoods. Their story wasn't a warning told to frighten boys. It was a rule for survival. The 8th generation had not yet come, but the ground was ready, the bloodline strong, and the valley waiting. Men could feel it when the wind went still, when the dogs in town fell silent. It was more than fear. It was respect, a grudging recognition that Eli's choice in that first blizzard had worked. The Blackwoods survived, and Millbrook would survive too, so long as it obeyed the pact. And so, year after year, winter after winter, Millbrook waited. The storms kept coming. The howls kept closer, and every man knew in his bones that the valley would one day come calling again. The sons of Eli Blackwood grew up with fur against their skin, paws against their ribs, breath hot in the cold cabin. From birth, they were never alone. The dogs were their cradle and shield. Their first steps were taken between growling guardians. Their first words sounded like barks, clipped and guttural. The valley itself seemed to teach them. They learned to run before they could speak, learned silence before language. Visitors claimed the boys never cried. If hunger came, they growled low, almost politely. When frightened, they dropped to all fours, crawling toward the nearest dog as if that creature was the only safe ground. By adolescence, their shoulders had broadened, their jaws grown sharp. When they smiled, there was too much tooth. The valley air raised them like wild saplings, bent but unbroken, growing toward something unseen beyond the reach of ordinary men. The dogs were no longer just companions. They were teachers. The boys learned from them, when to crouch, when to stalk, how to hear the crack of a branch a quarter mile away. Neighbors began to notice the strange unity. When one Blackwood boy turned his head, the others mirrored him, like a flock of crows catching the same wind. They hunted together, moved together, even slept in a perfect line. At dusk, the valley sounded alive. Howls rose like hymns, layered and haunting. Men walking home from the tavern swore they heard boys laughing inside those howls, a sound too human to ignore, too feral to dismiss. Teachers complained the Blackwood sons rarely spoke in class. They sat still, unblinking, as though measuring every man's words. When the bell rang, they flinched not in surprise, but as though the noise pained them. One winter, a merchant delivering goods to the farm saw something he would never forget. A Blackwood boy crouched by the hearth, feeding scraps to a dog with his own mouth, as if sharing communion. By the third generation, every newborn was given a hound before he could walk. These were not common dogs. Their bloodlines were carefully guarded, bred for strength, endurance, and something else the valley whispered about. Their coats were dark as ash, their eyes amber, their heads massive. Strangers swore they watched like men do, as if every blink contained thought, as if they judged whether you belonged on their land. Each Blackwood boy learned the valley paths blindfolded. Fathers led them through the snow by hand, teaching them every stone, every hollow tree, until they could find the homestead in pitch darkness by instinct alone. Hunters spoke of hearing footsteps keeping pace with them beyond the ridge. Sometimes they swore they saw two shapes, one upright, one loping low, moving perfectly together, breath fogging in unison in the moonlight. The dogs guarded the cradles. Anyone who stepped too close without permission swore they saw teeth flash white in the dark. No man dared test them. Not once was a Blackwood child harmed. The bond between boys and hounds deepened into something almost holy. They shared meat, fire, even sleep. And as each boy grew, his features sharpened into something less town-born, more wild, like bark grown over stone. When outsiders mocked them, the boys never fought in town. They only stared, silent, heads tilted. Men said it felt like standing before something you had no right to provoke. Most never mocked twice. The dogs themselves grew stranger. Their ears pricked to distant sounds, their heads tilting as if listening to voices no man could hear. Sometimes they circled the house at night, moving in patterns too precise for chance. At gatherings, the boys stood at the edges, their dogs at heel, neither speaking unless spoken to. And when they did speak, their voices held a strange roughness, as if carrying the valley wind inside. Fathers began to notice how quickly their sons healed from cuts, how rarely they fell sick. Frostbite never took them, even in the bitterest cold. Some whispered that sleeping between hounds gave them the strength of beasts. The fourth generation brought even more unsettling signs. One winter morning, a mail carrier found claw marks on a frozen pond, circling where a boy had fallen through the ice. The boy was alive, unscathed. When asked how he survived, he only smiled. Behind him, The dogs sat perfectly still, their chests heaving slow, their muzzles wet, as if they had pulled him from the water themselves. The valley grew quieter each passing year, as if respecting what lived within it. Birds abandoned nests near the Blackwood property. Deer took wider paths. The only sound at night was that rising chorus of howls. Stories spread of boys who could see in the dark, who could smell blood in the snow, who could track a man faster than a hound could. Men said the valley had chosen them. When the Blackwood boys came to town, fathers told their sons to look away. Some said you could feel them watching, not with hostility, but with the quiet patience of something that could wait generations. And still, each newborn was laid between two hounds. Each boy learned the ways of the valley. Each one grew into something both familiar and unnerving, as if human and animal were no longer separate. The townsfolk began adding new rules to their old ones. Rules no one wrote down, but everyone followed. Never call a Blackwood boy by name at night. Never whistle near the valley. There were nights when the howls turned to something else entirely. A chorus that sounded like men singing. The sound traveled miles, rattling windows, making even the bravest hunters stay close to their fires. It wasn't hatred that kept Millbrook away. It was respect, a grudging, fearful respect. The Blackwoods had carved a place in the valley, and whatever they were becoming, they had earned the right to be left alone. One stormy night, an old trapper claimed he saw 3 Blackwood boys on the ridge, crouched between their hounds, heads lifted together. Lightning struck, and for an instant, their silhouettes looked less human than ever. The trapper left Millbrook by morning, saying nothing. But others saw the change too. The sharpened faces, the unblinking stares, the way the boys seemed to sense things before they happened. By the close of the century, the Blackwoods were legend. To see one was to see the valley itself. The sons no longer needed to be feared to be obeyed. Their silence was enough. The valley waited, patient as ever. The boys grew into men, the dogs into giants. And through each passing season, Millbrook learned that some bloodlines were not meant to fade, but to sharpen with time. The children of the hounds had become something more than men, and the town had stopped pretending otherwise. The line between farmer and beast was gone. What remained was a pact no storm could break.